supporting federal government contractors and subcontractors comply with the federal affirmative action regulations. So it's with that backdrop that myself and my colleague Mike are providing a lot of advice and counsel around workplace analytics, namely the affirmative action plans. But there is an intersection that takes place between affirmative action and diversity and inclusion. And so today we're going to focus on that intersection. And so before we dive in, I think one of the things that we would note here is when it comes to federal contractor mandated affirmative action plans and companies undertaking various diversity initiatives, there oftentimes is quite a large divide, and there are a number of reasons for this. One is who owns the process. Right? Affirmative action plan compliance, dealing with OFCCP matters, oftentimes that resides within compliance or a small compartment of the HR group, maybe legal. Diversity and inclusion, however, oftentimes stands on its own, oftentimes with direct reporting lines to the board or the CEO, depending on how your organization is structured. Another reason why there's oftentimes a big divide here is budget. Compliance is seen as just that. It doesn't enhance the bottom line. It is a cost, an internal cost at that. So oftentimes compliance doesn't receive the same types of funding or budgeting that perhaps a diversity and inclusion group might, because they're seen as more driving the bottom line. There's also oftentimes a question around utility. Right? How much utility exists in the affirmative action world when it's not really seen as particularly helpful, right? So sometimes there's just a lack of ownership from within an organization. And then there's attitude. As I mentioned before, affirmative action is oftentimes seen as a necessary evil. It is compliance. So with that as a backdrop, we have diversity and inclusion, which is oftentimes seen as a business imperative. Right? It's necessary to grow, expand the business. And so because of these reasons, oftentimes these ownership of these processes, whether it's affirmative action plan development and implementation or development of D&I initiatives, are going to be in their own silos. What we're going to focus on today is how do we break down those silos? How do we bridge that gap? Because we're firm believers, and we actually support many of our clients in accomplishing this objective of using all of the data that you collect for these affirmative action plans, as well as the analytics contained in the affirmative action plans as that bridge to support D&I initiatives. All right? So that's the context, if you will, or the playing field that we're going to be talking about today. So just a couple other preliminary notes around affirmative action versus diversity. There's this concept of mandatory versus voluntary, right? So federal contractor affirmative action plans are required by law. You do business with the federal government, you have to prepare these affirmative action plans. You're going to be subjected to periodic audit by the OFCCP, whereas diversity initiatives, those are voluntary. Right? There's no mandatory requirement around that. Another difference here are quote-unquote neutral practices versus race or gender-based or tinged decisions. Under the federal affirmative action regulations, right up front, in the first section, it makes clear that nothing in these regulations is intended to have an employer base its employment decisions on race or gender. But to the contrary, employers subject to these regulations should be deploying their employment processes in a completely race and gender neutral way. Whereas when we think about diversity initiatives, the whole point of what we're doing is to drive race and gender diversity. So there's an implied tinge, if you will, or hint of making decisions and deploying initiatives and efforts around race and gender. And then there's the concept of data-based versus values culture. Again, I kind of mentioned this before. This is the concept of are you relying exclusively on mandated reports and data and taking care of a compliance initiative, or are you doing something that you're trying to align with your core business values and your culture? And so there's that divide there. But there is a fair amount of commonality between affirmative action plans and diversity initiatives. Mitigation of risk, right? Both, in large part, are intended to identify potential liability. The improvement of recruitment and selection processes, right? Both oftentimes have components associated with them that are designed to specifically get at any types of bottlenecks or barriers when it comes to the recruitment and selection of diverse candidates. Both will identify gaps in workforce representation, right? Where do we seem to be represented less than we would like to or expect to be? We can identify trends in our workplace activities, our daily employment decisions. So in the affirmative action world, we might refer to these as adverse impact analyses, where we're looking at selection rates by hiring, promotions, or terminations, right? There's no reason why that doesn't overlap into the world of diversity, right? When you're trying to identify or locate trends that may cause you not to achieve some of the objectives you want from a diversity perspective. Both affirmative action plans and diversity initiatives are looking for opportunities for improvement, right? Where are the limitations? Where are opportunities to do better? And both, if properly constructed, are data-driven devices, right? In today's day and age, everything is based on data, and in some cases, a lot of cases, big data. Right? We rely on data to tell us stories, and frankly, these programs are no different. All right? So we're going to focus a fair amount on that. Okay, so speaking of data, let's talk about some of this. So the first thing is that in today's day and age, especially with the robust systems of record, or HRIS, systems that are out there for employers, you know that there is a lot of data available to mine. So we should be mindful of that. We should be mindful of it both for internal uses, but also thinking about risk mitigation, the fact that somebody may be able to get that data from you, whether it's a government agency like the OFCCP conducting an audit, or it's a private litigant who has brought a case against you. Another thing to think about here is, what are your goals and objectives, right? So we're going to talk about a lot of different ways that you can analyze data and things that you can glean from that data as part of our conversation today. But we're not fans of analyzing for the sake of analyzing, but rather we believe in analyzing as part of getting at a solution to a specific problem, or in an effort to support a specific objective, like a specific diversity initiative, for example, right? What better way to know that you are addressing a problem that you want to address than by having data that supports not only the initiative that you're undertaking, but also will demonstrate that you're achieving that initiative. Right? How should you analyze and how often? This is the old analysis paralysis issue. And here's our perspective on it. Right? If you're analyzing more than once a year, in all likelihood you're analyzing too much. right? So the idea that you're going to analyze multiple times in a year can cause problems for you because you're always going to be chasing data. And by the time you analyze that data and you prepare an action plan to deal with it, guess what? You're on to collecting the next set of data. Right? So you want to avoid analysis paralysis. And the other thing you want to think about is when it comes to analysis in support of any diversity initiatives you have, what is your focus, right? Are you looking at specific establishments of yours? Are you looking at the business unit or organizational unit? Are you looking at the entire enterprise? Are you looking at your workforce in its entirety? Or in most cases, are you breaking up that workforce into some sort of hierarchy or strata? Right? So you want to think about, again, when it comes to data and analysis, what is your objective, where are you focused on, because that will guide you as you pull that information together. And then at a couple points during our discussion today, we'll talk about the importance of privilege, right? Anytime you undertake analysis for purposes of self-critical assessment, those analyses are potentially discoverable in litigation. And that's something which you may not want to be discoverable. So it's important that you engage attorneys from the outset of these types of projects so that they can lead the projects for the purpose of dispensing legal advice to the organization. So the strongest privilege is going to be with outside counsel, but at the very least, you definitely want to make sure that you have your own in-house counsel engaged in these processes. Okay, so what are some of the things that you would see in your basic affirmative action plan? So we kind of break them down into three parts here, right? So the first is utilization, right? This is a representational analysis. What do you look like in comparison to certain benchmarks or availability? All right, so do you have as many, more or less, females at various levels within the organization than you would expect given that benchmark or availability? Well, where the answer to that question is you have significantly less, then you end up setting goals, and those are your traditional affirmative action plan goals. And then each year, since AAP development is an annual process, you're going to look back and you're going to say, okay, well, what did I do or how did I do when it came to the goals that I set for last year? Did I achieve them? Right? And then the third major area that you're looking at each year in these plans is your adverse impact analyses, right? So what is the impact of your hiring, promotion, and termination processes? So when you compare selection rates by race and gender for hires, promotions, or terminations, are you finding that there are significant differences in those selection rates? Right? So all of these analyses are intended to show you a potential problem, not necessarily a problem, right? Not something that is a liability, but they're intended to show you where these types of issues might exist. And then really it's a matter of undertaking further analysis to understand whether they are true issues, true problems, and what is the root cause. And this is where we start to see overlap from a D&I perspective, right? So if you're interested, for example, first you identify a gap, right? Let's say it's a representation gap. It's women at the senior director level within your organization, right? Well, that's just part of understanding the issue, right? You see the gap. But you want to get at what the root cause of that is. And so you're going to leverage additional data. For example, you may look at your adverse impact analyses and say, hey, is there a selection rate difference here? Are we not seeing women getting hired into those positions at the same rate as males, let's say? Or is it a progression issue? Is it something in promotions? Again, the adverse impact analysis might help identify that. So whether it's a goal for female representation at the senior director level or a diversity initiative to increase female representation at all levels of management, you can see how these start to fit together. All right. So, but it's also important to understand what's not in your affirmative action plan explicitly, but is beneath the surface. Okay. So the first thing is that your affirmative action plans, they're not real-time analysis. They're based on historical data. All right, which means that they may not always represent the current state of affairs, and you should bear that in mind. Second thing you should understand about the affirmative action plans is, at least from a representational standpoint, they don't necessarily get at individual race group representation. Right? They treat all minorities in the aggregate. Increasingly, OFCCP is focused on individual minority issues or individual race issues with regard to compensation or adverse impact, but not so much on the representation level yet. Next, the affirmative action plans do not require in-depth analysis in the absence of statistical indicators, which means that a lot of times you'll generate data, you'll do a cursory analysis on it, but it won't help inform anything else for you because you're not required to go any further with it, but it may have a value in a D&I perspective. Affirmative action plans generally don't analyze information by job title. So there may be limitations there. It may, but not explicitly, have information on timing issues, right? How long it takes, for example, for an applicant, for a job to get opened between the time it gets closed, right? What's that gap? From a recruiting standpoint, that may be an important piece of information that you can glean from this data. Similarly with time to promotion. And then the other thing that is not explicitly in the affirmative action plan are pipeline analyses. So these are looking at things like, several hierarchies down, how well represented are you for a particular group and how that bodes for the future, even though, again, the data is likely there. All right? So the important thing to take away sort of from this preliminary information about what the affirmative action plans are and aren't is that these plans can be used as diversity tools. Right now, your affirmative action plan does everything on a job group by job group basis. Job groups being nothing more than similar jobs in terms of content, wages, and opportunities for advancement. Job groups are good from the perspective of they generally give you substantial sample size for purposes of analytical power, but they're kind of artificial constructs, right? If you think about it, when you set up an organizational structure, you're not thinking about this concept of job group. You may be thinking of things like job families, levels, salary grades, those sort of organizational principles, as opposed to this artificial construct that comes from the affirmative action obligations or regulations explicitly. All right. So job groups are going to be your unit of analysis within the affirmative action plans, but job groups may not be a good unit of analysis for purposes of your diversity initiatives. But understand the data that goes into those affirmative action plans is still going to have everything you need in order to get more discrete than job group. Okay. So a couple other what I would call limitations to the affirmative action plans, some of these we touched on before, is the affirmative action plans, as I said, are designed to analyze by job group. And as I mentioned before, you don't make decisions based on job group. You make decisions based on individual jobs. Who's going to fill them, whether it be externally or internally, whatever the case may be. Affirmative action plans, as a general rule, are prepared on an establishment basis. And you probably don't think about your organization. Your business leaders do not think about your organization necessarily on an establishment basis. So these artificial cuts sometimes can be a detriment when you want to see things at a little bit broader perspective. Because affirmative action plans are compliance tools, oftentimes they're really just at as, all right, well, how do I limit my exposure? Right? How do I create the fewest action items for me, the fewest areas that the government might follow up if they were to audit me, as opposed to saying, hey, I'm going to find as many potential issues as I can to make sure that I have all my pathways to diversity and equal employment opportunity open. The affirmative action plans also are limited in that they only look at 12 months worth of data. And depending on the volume of activity you have in your organization in any given year, a 12-month period may not be enough. But as I mentioned before, since you do these affirmative action plans on an annual basis, the good news is you're going to have data going back several years, and you may want to rely on a broader data set to do some of this. And so again, ultimately the affirmative action plans are designed to answer certain questions as the government and the regulations that they put in place designed them to answer, right? As opposed to the questions you want answered. But as you've heard me say several points during the first part of this presentation, all of the information that you're either retaining because of these regulations or are analyzing and aggregating for the affirmative action plans will help you in almost all instances answer the questions you want to be answered, especially as they relate to your diversity and inclusion initiatives. All right? So no, the plans are not useless. You just need to know where to look. All right? So to start to lift the veil over that, at some of the places you can look, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mike, who's going to take us through some examples.
Thank you, Matt. Let's get to the next slide here. Okay. Well, as Matt was saying, there's plenty of information within the AAPs. It's just on the D&I folks now to look into those AAPs to see what's really going on here. There's a lot of information right in front of you containing your AAPs. There is value in looking at this, at the analytics of these AAPs, not just plan by plan or location by location, but for instance, looking for trends that may emerge across your AAPs. For an example, seeing consistently underutilized females within sales positions in every one of the plans. That can be an identifier that you might have an enterprise-wide issue in your recruiting efforts in attracting female applicants into the sales roles. Another way you can look at it is if you're seeing, what are you seeing over time? If you have been doing affirmative action plans and preparing them annually for the past 3 or 4 years, and you're seeing over the past 3 or 4 years that the female sales workers, you have goals for female sales workers year after year. That may be another indicator that your good faith outreach efforts or your recruiting efforts aren't being effective. That can be an indicator that your recruiting efforts need to change in regards to females within sales workers, or it can be an identifier of something else. It can be from individuals being driven out of the application process once they apply. That will bring me to my next slide. So in every single AAP, you'll have an adverse impact analysis run, and specifically with hiring, hiring discrimination has been on the forefront of the OFCCP. And as you can see, here, it's just an example of an adverse impact analysis for females and minorities in hiring. And you can see where there's a standard deviation highlighted in yellow, either going against males or females, minorities and non-minorities. And as you can see there's individual hotspots within individual AAPs, particularly maybe by location if that's how they're set up. Or you can see that there's some hotspots. So examples for physicians in AAPs 5 and 6, you could see there's actually 2 indicators against physicians for non-minorities. And you would not know this unless you've laid the information out in this way to see where the indicators of adverse impact are in hiring to drive down and help in your diversity and inclusion efforts. All right, so now we're going to look at the utilization trends for minorities here. We have 5 AAPs. Let's assume that there were 7 plans, and 5 of those plans within the organization had a minority goal in administrative support. This shows that they're either having difficulties in attracting minority applicants here to apply for administrative support roles throughout the organization or within these 5 AAPs. As you can see, you had a goal in every single year. And then you could see that 3 of those goals were not met. In addition, that is where the adverse impact analyses can overlap with goal achievement. It might not just be your recruiting efforts that are an issue in achieving minorities within admins, but it could be the issue of retaining or hiring minorities once they get into the application process. And seeing year-over-year goals suggests that your minority outreach needs to be re-examined. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the intersection between goals and adverse impact. So as you can see from the chart above, you'll see where the job group here within the AP is directors. You had a goal for females here, and then you also had an indicator of adverse impact in hiring. If you have goals or unmet goals, it could either be outreach, or maybe you're not getting enough applicants or enough hires because they're falling out of the application selection process for one reason or another. However, in looking at this report, you could see that your application rate for females is 87.5%. That's a very high application rate for females. So that indicates that you are getting enough, or a good majority of your applicants are females. That's not the struggle here. The struggle here in taking a look at these analyses is once females get into that application selection process, why were none hired? Why was the standard deviation of 4.12 of an indicator of statistical significance in the selection rates for females versus males? So that would be an indicator of what you would want to look at, what your D&I efforts need to go to. Do you need to look into who is hiring, making these hiring decisions, what department is making these hiring decisions, maybe look at the application process as a whole to look into why females may not be succeeding in the hiring process. These are all statistics and reports that you can use to dive into your diversity and inclusion efforts. And with that, I think, Matt, are you
Yep.
at this next slide?
Good. So what you can start to see now, for those last couple of slides that Mike showed you, all of those analyses, all of those outputs will be found in your affirmative action plan, right? So without doing any type of additional analysis, you can already start to see some of the challenges that your organization may be facing from a diversity perspective. And so if the question you're asking yourself is, well, gosh, why aren't we better represented at the director level with women, right? This is starting to answer that question for you outside of just, did you run the analyses for the affirmative action plan, right? We see that we're underrepresented, but at the same time we see that our outreach and recruitment is actually doing quite well. So just with this line of data, what we realize is we can start to diagnose the root problem here and hopefully eliminate that problem so that we can be better represented for women at that level, right? And we're going to focus in this instance on the hiring process. right? So that's really basic stuff, right? It's already in the affirmative action plan. You don't need to analyze it any differently, and yet it's going to help advance the ball or help you answer the question that you have. However, sometimes the affirmative action plans and what they have as an output, just generally speaking, are not going to help you answer the question sufficiently, which means you may have to go a bit further. So for example, as I mentioned before, these affirmative action plans are broken down by establishment and job group. Right? And you may not be thinking about that, right? Because you may be running a report for your executive committee of all directors, right? So our entire organization, we only have 5% female representation at the director level. So at that point, the affirmative action plans themselves become somewhat limited to help you address that issue or answer the question as to why, because they're done by establishment by establishment. So you may need to, as Mike showed a few slides earlier, start to aggregate the plans and their outcomes, or aggregate their data and run new analyses. The other issue with the affirmative action plans is the affirmative action plan analytics are prescribed by regulation. Right? So the OFCCP directs us exactly how to run these types of analyses, but they don't always necessarily get to the heart of the issue. So for example, let's say you're concerned with retention. Right? Let's say it's minority representation or retention at the entry-level professional ranks, or all professionals for that matter. If you run an adverse impact analysis on terminations the way that the government instructs you to, you're including all separations in that analysis. You're not distinguishing, for example, between people who we choose to terminate versus those people who leave us. Right? So because these analyses are prescribed in a certain way, they may not help answer the question, why do we have retention issues for minorities in our professional ranks? But the data is going to be there, even though you don't analyze it that way. And then the third thing is that these AAP metrics oftentimes don't go far enough because they are, again, prescribed to do a certain thing. Right? They're designed to identify certain flags, and in those circumstances, you have an action item to respond to those flags. But if there's no flag, then you're like, okay, I don't have to do anything here. So you won't necessarily look beneath the surface when you're trying to dig further for answers to certain questions. All right? So the solution here, as I mentioned before, is to marshal additional data, additional analyses that come from the same source as your affirmative action plans in order to address these issues. All right? So when doing this, it's important to set out, I guess for lack of a better term, a project plan, right? What is it you're looking to achieve? So the first thing is look at your AP results, right? What are they telling us? What do they tell the stakeholders, the plan owners, about the organization, right? What questions are we now asking as a result? And then we need to design what it is we're going to look at. Right? So we've identified the question that we're asking. How are we going to analyze the data we have available to get at the solution? Right? Then we have to get the data. Right? The hope is you've already got it. Right? You've already got it pulled for the affirmative action plan development, but you may have to go an extra layer, a little bit deeper, and draw on some additional repositories for data. Then you want to conduct the analyses. All right, so you're going to want to design, conduct the analyses, and then of course you want to do something with the results. Right? There's nothing worse than running a set of self-critical analyses that show or confirm your problem, and then you don't do anything about them. Right? That's sort of smoking gun evidence in litigation terms. And then sometimes you need to do it more than once, and the reason for that is you missed something along the way. right? You didn't contemplate something that now that you're at the end of the process, you realize, oh, you know what, I didn't account for that. Let's go back to step 2 and fix that. And then once again, all of this, we would strongly encourage that you wrap in privilege so that you have the option as to when and how the information gets revealed. Okay. So what can you or should you analyze? Well, honestly, the answer is anything. But the question for you is ultimately, what problem are you trying to solve for, right? What issue do you want to address? Is it outreach and recruitment? Is it something in the selection process, the hiring process, let's say, such as testing or your use of basic or minimum qualifications? Is it what we describe here, distribution of opportunities? In other words, what does progression within the organization look like? Do minorities and females progress at stable rates from the bottom to the top of the organization, or do we see prolific die-offs or fall-offs when it comes to those progression rates? Sometimes what we're concerned with are what I would describe as bad actors, right? And it may be intentional, it may be unintentional for that matter, but if you think about it, all employment decisions are made by human beings. They're made by people, and people are far from perfect. But these types of analyses can help isolate individuals who are helping to drive problems in the organization. And then you have an opportunity to help address it, right, through re-education and training opportunities, or tightening up processes and not having quite so much discretion available to individuals. All right? So let's take this to the next level, right? So let's get beyond these AAPs. Let's talk about what it is we can look at and how we can look at it, just by way of example, right? And so we're going to focus here on personal activity data. All right? So applicants, hires, promotions, terminations. In an affirmative action plan, you would have this information broken down by job group, all right? But for your purposes, you may want to look at it more on at a hierarchy level, right? And so you can see in this particular instance, that's what we've done, is we've broken it down by levels. So our executives, directors, managers, senior professionals. And you can see there's a whole lot of information that we've thrown in here, right? So we've got the number of hires, how many of them are women, how many promotions in total, how many of those went to women, how many terminations, how many of those terminations or separations were women. So you can see we're going to be focused on gender for purposes of illustration here. Then immediately below that, what we can see is information on female representation in the organization, right? So how many people make up these groupings, these strata, and how many of them are women. Right? We also can see applicants, right? So how many applicants are applying, how many of them are women, and then we have an availability or a benchmark figure, so some sort of labor market reference point that tells us how many women are available for the jobs that make up these particular strata. Right? And you can see purely observationally that there are some interesting things that come out of this. All right? And I won't belabor it because Mike's going to take us through a few items, but just one thing really quick that you can see here is if you look at your availability percentage versus your applicant percentages that are made up of women, you can see in 3 of these 4 groups, the organization is doing well, right? If we look at executives, where we have female availability of 25%, and 10 of our 15 total applicants to executive jobs during this review period that we're looking at were women, well, we're attracting women at a 67% clip. That far exceeds the availability. For that matter, it also far exceeds the percentage of women in the workforce, where we only have 2 out of 12. Right? So literally just looking observationally at some of this data, we can start to glean information and start to solve for problems. So what kind of problems can we solve for? Recruiting issues, hiring issues, promotion issues, termination issues, and how all of that relates back to what I would call bottom line diversity issues, and that is representation. Right? At the end of the day, that's what most employers are interested in, is we want to look a certain way, and if we don't, we want to know A, why, and B, what we can do about it. All right, so with that, Mike, why don't you take us through a couple examples here, and we can see how we can leverage this data that I just went through.
Yeah, absolutely. So setting aside that AAPs and setting goals or indicators of adverse impact, there's still valuable information here, as Matt was saying, to evaluate diversity recruitment, or among females or for minorities. Generally, the above chart explains how you can do that. You can specifically look to see how you compare to the external labor market. So for the example here, for the executives, directors, and managers, the company here is getting great applicant flow from females here. You can clearly eyeball and see where the issue is, and that issue is in getting female applicants into your senior professionals. And it's using this data that you can hone in on the main issue, and it will assist you in telling your HR managers or your talent acquisition team where your struggle areas are in recruiting for females. It just makes the process that much easier in your D&I efforts. And then moving from the recruiting data, you can move on to the hiring data. So once applicants are brought into the application selection process, you could see whether there are barriers within the process along gender or race lines. And you can see here that there is barriers in hiring for females. You could see for your senior professionals, again, the expected amount of female hires within the senior professionals is 25, and this company only hired 8. Again, this data is not shown on your goals or in your adverse impact analyses. This is just your raw personal activity data that you can use to focus on where the hiring issues are. So you'll see that the hiring issue is in senior professionals. Then you can narrow in to see in what point of the process, in the hiring process, are females being either leaving the process or not advancing in the process. And if there's some type of barrier within the hiring process that is causing this lack of female representation in hiring. Okay, then the next one would be about preferential hiring. So from a D&I perspective, the D&I team is usually being asked to move the needle on purposes of improving diversity in the workforce, in the company. So at what point can an employer take race or gender into consideration in making a hiring decision, for instance, or promotion or any personal activity decision? The general rule prohibits employers from basing employment decisions on the basis of race or gender. However, there is Supreme Court law out there that supports the consideration of race or gender, an employment decision under very limited circumstances. For instance, there needs to be some statistical basis showing that certain individuals have not been afforded equal employment opportunities, and it also has to be narrowly tailored. It's not a black and white issue. There's a lot of gray with this. So the takeaway here is to always consult with counsel before running any D&I diversity and inclusion program, whether it is in hiring, promotions, terminations, or during the application process. So from there, I'm going to move to the using the promotions data. And the promotions data, the raw personal activity data, can show where the promotion opportunities are and whether there's any stopgaps between different levels. As you can see here, there seems to be a very high percentage of females being promoted from senior professionals into the manager role and then managers to directors. But there seems to be a stopgap, or another word for a glass ceiling, at the point of director to executive. There were 0 female promotions here. Again, this can be an indicator of something to look into further. Are these competitive versus non-competitive promotions? It gives you a reason to dive into the promotion process and to see whether females are being have barriers in the promotion process within the company. And then that will bring me into the last personal activity data would be your terminations or turnover data. This situation where there appears to be, a glass ceiling, and looking at the previous promotions data and also looking at the terminations data here. It appears that women are stalling at the higher levels within the company and leaving at a higher rate compared to the males within the organization. As you can see, that once they get up to the director level, there's a big jump in the percentage of female terminations. That would be another reason why to dig in and see why are females terminating at a higher rate once they get to a higher level, or a higher level within the organizations compared to males. All right, now we're going to identify the process barriers. So we have a female goal here in executives, and they appear to have, good faith outreach efforts. They get a good percentage of applicants. However, they are not hiring or promoting females within the organization, and females are leaving at a higher percentage than males. So what does this tell us? There's a challenge of getting females into these jobs and retaining them. It all can be related. There could be many different issues. There could be male dominance at the executive levels within the organization. And another example is that the company might not have family-friendly leave policies. And also there could be pay equity issues. So all of these, and bringing them all together, the applicants, your hires, your promotions, and your terminations, the raw data outside of just looking at the AAP goals and adverse impact can tailor your initiatives to certain areas within the organization, really drive down what needs to be looked at. And I will bring it back over to Matt for the takeaways.
Yep. So we'll make this quick because I know we got a late start, and we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So look, I think what you can tell from this very short time we had here together, that you're really just scratching the surface when you're talking about your affirmative action plans for a whole host of reasons. But don't let it end there. That's just the beginning, because the data that you pull together, the analytics that you have as part of those plans, or the analytics that you can build off of the data that you've pulled together for those plans, all can help you address issues or problems that need to be solved. Right? So from a D&I perspective, right, it's going to be much more important than just having a bottom line analysis of, yeah, we're underrepresented for women. Right? What is causing it? Where are the barriers? Right? Then you can start to address those problems in a comprehensive way. In other words, you can tailor your solution to exactly what the problem is. If you run a basic analysis that says that you are underrepresented for women at certain levels of management in the organization, and you don't have a sense of why, you're going to end up doing a whole bunch of diversity and inclusion initiatives that may or may not be helpful to you. And that's not a good use of resources, especially when resources are scarce in these days. So the important thing is be informed, right? Leverage all of this data, all these analytics to help you identify exactly where your problem is and craft a customized solution to address it. And the affirmative action plans, yes, the old stodgy, federally required affirmative action plans are a great place to start. All right, so with that, I want to thank everybody for joining. Rathin, I don't know if we have your audio back. Well, it appears that that technical glitch has not been solved. So the contact information for both Mike and I and Rathin will be included in the presentation, which will be sent out following today's webinar. So if you have any questions or issues, obviously feel free to reach out to any of us. There is certain HRCI credit which will be available, and information on that will be sent out following our wrap-up today. So again, just want to thank everybody for their time. Hopefully we have stimulated some interesting thoughts on your part and perhaps some initiatives that you might undertake as you sync up your affirmative action plans and your D&I initiatives. So once again, everyone, thank you so much for joining us.